Kia ora, I'm Patsy Reddy and I'm Governor-General of New Zealand, so representing our Head of State, the Queen, Queen Elizabeth in New Zealand. As Governor-General, I'm effectively the Head of State in New Zealand, so I sign into effect all laws or bills to become law, and I preside over the Executive Council of the Cabinet. I also have the role of dismissing Parliament, calling elections and appointing, most importantly, a new government, so swearing in the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's Cabinet every 3 years. As well as that, I have a series of community roles and ceremonial roles in my role as Head of State. It is really important that we have female role models. I think back to when I was a child, growing up in the 60s, coming to university in the 70s. You know, apart from the obvious role model that I had, who was my mother, every child has their mother to start with. My mother worked, she was a school teacher, so in those days, in the 50s and 60s, that was relatively unusual. I can remember being a bit embarrassed that my mother worked, actually, that she wasn't at home cooking like everyone else's mother. But I soon realised by the time I went to university that I certainly wanted to follow in those footsteps. But the only other significant role model that I would have had in those days, when I think back on it, was probably the Queen. She was our Queen at the time, and she was our Head of State and probably the most famous and most important woman in the world. Indeed, almost the most famous person in the world. So she's been a pretty constant role model for a lot of us, I think, through that time. But there were so few others. There were so few parliamentarians, there were no judges. So I went to law school, I studied law. I think there were only about 5 to 10% of us law students in the 70s who were female. And there were very few women lawyers at the time. So my role models, I think now it's so important that we do have so many more role models, right from indeed the Head of State, but in particular Prime Minister, Chief Justice, right through Parliament. And getting that gender balance is important, still important. It wasn't enough just to be like a man. So I certainly went to law school trying to achieve equality by learning the rules of rugby, the rules of cricket, learning how to talk with men, learning how to be regarded as an equal with men, which I needed to do in business and in law, without understanding that actually I wanted to be treated as a woman, but on equal terms with a man. And one of the most important things I think we didn't understand at the time was for women, particularly women who wanted to have families, there needed to be more than just equal pay, there needed to be pay equity, there needed to be appropriate childcare. To me, that was something that was beyond my wildest dream. You will find quite a lot of us that went through in my era didn't have children because that wasn't really, there wasn't really space for it in the way in which our lives had developed and in terms of our perceptions of what equity enabled us to do at those days. The first job I had after law school, I did some OE, but when I got back, the first sort of full-time job I had was teaching as a junior lecturer at law school, at my law school, which was Victoria. The reason I got that job is because I couldn't get a job in a law firm. Every interview I went to, it was clear that actually they wanted males, not females. And I was quite shocked by that because at university I think I had been treated fairly and equally and I had done well. So I wasn't expecting not to do well in interviews. So that was my first shock. So I went teaching, but I realised actually that that wasn't what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. My parents had both been teachers and it just, I wanted to move on. So I did. By then I'd got a master's degree and I'd got some experience teaching, so I was able to have another go at joining law firms, and I did join the workforce as a lawyer in private practice. There were very few other women in fact, I chose a firm deliberately that was pretty forward-thinking and I think welcomed women. So there were a couple of other women lawyers, no women partners at that stage. I was the first woman partner. But most areas, and I was a business lawyer, so I worked in the commercial field, and most of my clients were men. Every engagement I had in those days was with men, and then when I joined business, I went into the commercial workforce and took governance roles, became a director of several companies. I was always the only woman in the room. So that was when I realised, I needed to continue this. Being able to be treated equal to a man meant being able to converse on equal terms, and they only wanted to talk about whatever men wanted to talk about. So I didn't actually have the confidence or the support of other women to be diverse and to be myself. And I think that was a common problem for women in those days. And as I look back on it, after the 80s, when women became, I think by about the end of the 80s, there were more female students or graduates in most of our tertiary institutions than male. So I felt that we'd made it, but actually we just tread water, or in fact went a little bit backwards for the next couple of decades. And that was when we realised that the Equal Pay Act didn't solve anything. What we needed was pay equity. What we needed were working conditions that would enable women to be treated fairly and equitably. And we also needed to look at that gender pay gap. And that's really only happened in the last 10, maybe 20 years that we've really focused on that. So I was delighted when we finally got recognition of the importance of pay equity in the amendment last year to the Equal Pay Act. It's a really important change, I think, a really important signal. You know, there were some trailblazers that came before me, and some of them only a few years before me. Some of them like Marilyn Waring and Sue Kedgley, who really did make a difference because they were really prepared to stand up and be counted in a public way. Now, I was never one of those. I would march for, and did march for, abortion law reform and equal pay and homosexual law reform, but I was never one of the people leading the pack. So those trailblazers, and I think of Sandra Coney in the same way, but those trailblazers made a big difference. And then of course we had Dame Kath as our first Governor-General, female Governor-General in 1990, and then Dame Sylvia, our first High Court Judge, and our second female Governor-General. Those people really did open the doors. So I came through, as I say, I was in the private sector for most of that time, right through till more recent years, and when I joined the public sector. I think now there are so many role models that it's a different challenge now, and it's actually the challenge of being treated as individuals with your own rights and diverse views and diverse cultural views, and getting society, or those societal and cultural changes, to enable women to be truly, fully contributing to our communities. There's still a way to go. So sometimes I think it's hard not to be a little smug that here in New Zealand we've got not only female head of state, but a female Prime Minister, female Leader of the Opposition, female Chief Justice, and you know, a good level of female representation right through our senior management roles. We're a little bit light in private sector, but overall, particularly in public sector, we've got a good representation of women. I think it does show us in a great light internationally. I think it's perhaps even more important that we show that we've got diversity in those roles and they're not just, Pākehā, European Pākehā women. We have a range of women, so we've got our First Minister of Foreign Affairs who is Māori, and I think that's an exciting development for New Zealand. So I think we can afford to be a bit smug, but we all know there's still a way to go. As Governor-General, I felt pretty secure and confident, in my role as a female Governor-General, because we'd had these amazing trailblazers of Sylvia and Kath, both of whom I spoke to before I actually assumed the role. But I guess we'd got to a stage in our community, we'd had a number of women leaders. I felt that made it easier. I think the role of Governor-General is pretty scary anyway, because you can't really train for it and you certainly don't apply for it. So for anyone coming into a role like that, there is the challenge of, can I do it and what actually is it? For me, the challenge of public speaking, how can I possibly manage? I can remember being told I'd probably make, several speeches a week, and I was horrified to think that I would have to speak in public so often. But like any job, it's a matter of trial and error and being brave. So I think, I had the benefit of being older at the time I came into the role, so I didn't have quite the nerves I might have had if I'd been 20. But, it wasn't, I don't think me being female has made it any harder. I think I've been treated very equally in that sense. I'd say be bold, don't be defeated by your own inner sense of insecurity. We all have that. I don't think it's just women actually, but women traditionally have had that sense of not being good enough or being anxious not to do something that they might not succeed at. And I've battled that all my life, and when I look back I think I should have been bolder. And so there's no harm in failing, there's no harm in learning from things that don't quite work, and there's no problem about changing. I mean, some of our MPs, some of our greatest MPs have come to it through trial and error, trying different jobs. You don't always have a charmed existence, but I think having women that are prepared to take leadership roles, not just in central government, but local government, in councils, in school committees and so forth, that's really important, because we need every governance, every leadership role in New Zealand needs to be reflective of our community.